Yeah, I was a correction officer. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hey Sarge, my journey as a correction officer. I want to thank all of you guys for your support. I want to thank you for liking, sharing, commenting, hitting the thumbs up, subscribing. Thank you all so much. You don't know how much I appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But today I want to talk about following your chain of command and why it's so important. In different places, the chain of command varies. Now, I don't really remember how the chain of command go, but I do know that it's officer, sergeant, lieutenant, captain. Then I think it's major and then colonel. I think that's how it goes, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a minute, so don't hold it to me. Just research it for yourself. But wherever you're working at, wherever you are, the chain of command is important for one reason is because it establishes order. Another reason it's important is because it shows structure. When I first started working in corrections, the chain of command was something that we stuck by. We stuck by it. But over the years, it began to kind of slip away, and it was like it was there, but it was like, who cares, you know? But anyway, when I first started in the men institution, you followed that chain of command. It was you, and everything went by seniority after that. You know, it was like you and another officer there. Who started first? If he got a month more than you, okay, you at the bottom of the totem pole. You do it. You don't really do what he say, but he's gonna have more rights than you if you're under a sergeant that work like that, because it's you, the new officer, it's the officer who have more experience, then it's the sergeant. And that's how it worked. It was like if you was at the bottom, you was just at the bottom, but that officer would give that first dib to anybody who had more time. And you don't know, the next day you might have a day more than the other person. Guess what? You get those dibs. You know what I'm saying? It's the sergeant, then you, then the officer who started the day after you. So depending on who you're working with, that's just kind of how it went. Now, at that prison, your captain and your lieutenant came around. Now, me, when the captain and the lieutenant came around, most of the time, if the captain come, the lieutenant wouldn't, and vice versa. So most of the time when they came, I would go find something to do because I'm like, I don't need to be sitting up here talking to them. If there's anything that I need to know, I'm sure the sergeant would tell me. And that's how I handled it. I really never tried to be in the higher ups way. I just dealt with my sergeant, and you know, that's what I did. That was just me. Like, it was different people who did different things, but for me, I just wanted to stay out of the way. I wanted to come there, do my job, go home so I could get me a check. That's I was really just trying to stay out of the way. The institution that I first started working at, that's how I went dealing with the chain of command. I really didn't have to deal with the captains. I didn't have to deal with the colonels. Where we worked, it was just us in that room. We was stuck on that wing the whole shift. So I really didn't have to go out. I really didn't have to deal with anyone else. As I transitioned from that institution to another institution, the chain of command was a little bit different because it was set up a little different. Like, every dorm didn't have a sergeant in it. You probably had one sergeant on the whole compound because the compound wasn't big. Like, you probably had two or three sergeants, but it was one sergeant for two dorms. So one night you the big chief. It's just you and that by yourself, and then the other sergeant, he back and forth between y'all both. So you the big dog, you know, you handling the dorm, you running the dorm. Sometimes you may not have a direct sergeant. You might have to call over the radio for some help. And it's like different institutions vary. So once I transitioned from that institution to my final institution, because I actually worked at three different institutions, and my final institution was a female institution, you had a lot more chain of command. You had the officer, the sergeant, you had a lieutenant, you had a second lieutenant that was over a mental health dorm or a confinement dorm, and then you had the colonel, and later they added a major. So you saw a lot more progression with the chain of command there, but I didn't really have to deal with them too much. But when I worked over, oh yeah, I had to deal with the warden, the assistant warden. It went all the way up. You know, you deal with a lot more people. As far as the administration side, that's the chain of command. But chain of command also worked for you when you're dealing with inmates, because, and I'm going to speak from my experience working at the female prison, is you and your two officers. Sometimes you'll have two, sometimes you may have one. It just varies, but that chain of command works for you and your dormitory as well, because once you promote to a sergeant, you're no longer just in charge of you and the inmates. Now you're in charge of you, your staff, and the inmates. So it's more responsibility, and you have to know how to execute that. So that's why it's so important, as well as, like, when you get officers, you learn how to train them, or you learn how to be a good officer, because that sergeant got a lot of responsibility, and you have to know the chain of command. Like, you have to know how to maneuver. You have to know how to get these rules and enforce them, because if you don't, it's going to be a messed up dorm. It's going to be out of control. So let's speak from the form of an officer. If you're an officer and you're in that dorm, you need to establish the chain of command. If you're working for a sergeant, that sergeant shouldn't have anything to worry about. You should be a good enough officer that you could talk to the inmates and figure out the problem. You should be able to problem solve. You should be able to know how to maneuver. And if you don't know how to maneuver, then say, let me check with Sarge and see how to handle this. If you don't know, you don't know. Fine. That's how you learn. But you bring it back to your sergeant. Like, when I was a sergeant, I didn't allow inmates to come straight to me about a situation if they haven't talked to my officers yet. In some cases, yeah. But for the most part, I'm going to ask them, did you ask the officer? Because you ain't finna skip over them, because it's a form of disrespect. So you see what the officers say first. And if the officers said what they said, then they said what they said. Now, it's certain times you have to go in there and you have to dissect, is it the enforcement fair, and is it allowed? Are they doing the right thing? But that comes all with having good officers. And sometimes it may be right, but it just might not be good. Sometimes you, as a sergeant, you're going to have to say, well, that's the decision the officer made. That's the decision he made. You got to live with it. It just, because sometimes you could be doing something right, but really it don't make sense to do it. But if the officer made that decision, he made that decision. We're going to work with this chain of command, and we're going to figure it out, and we're going to make it work. We're going to have to make it work, because if we always working together, then the population have to know how we work. So when we know how we work, they know how we work. Everybody's on the same page. But when you get people who just skip all over the chain of command and they don't enforce certain things, like if you're a sergeant and you already told the officer, this is how we're going to do it, but when you leave, the officer let somebody else, the inmates, do something different, that's going to be a problem. Because now you walking back into a dorm that's unorganized. And now they see that you and this officer don't get along, so now it's a lot of trouble. Some people are going to come in there and feel privileged. Some people are going to feel like they don't have to do certain things, right? I had an experience with an officer, and I'm a sergeant. I don't have to do certain things. It's good that I do, because I was the type of sergeant that I'm going to work with my officers. We're going to work together. I'm going to do this. You're going to do this. We're going to do it together. But I don't necessarily have to do A, B, or C. That's your job. Really, it's your job. Like, I'm gonna do a video talking about the responsibilities of a sergeant. But just because I help you do a certain thing don't mean that I have to. I just do it because I work with my officers. And this is when certain people feel privileged, and you have to just kind of chop their head off and say, hey, you either do this or we're going to handle it this way. If somebody ain't doing what they have to do, you have to deal with it a different type of way. And I'm not going to tell you what type of ways those are. You figure that out for yourself. You learn from the people that you're working with. But it's so important for that officer to follow that chain of command too, because if they're trying to walk over you and you're the sergeant, then what that's going to say about you? The inmate's going to know that you don't got no authority, so they're going to go to that officer. And if that officer is a good officer, good, that's a good thing. But If that officer is kind of swayed or easily led to do something, now you in trouble because you're the supervisor and that officer letting things happen that shouldn't be happening. So I mean, it's a wormhole once you really start opening this thing up. But the chain of command is so important, and you have to establish it. You have to understand it. And you have to kind of go by it because if you don't, you setting yourself up for failure. I honestly believe that. I just honestly believe that when you don't follow it, you're setting yourself up for failure. Like I always try to be an asset whenever I work somewhere. And following that chain of command, many times it helped me. Many times it helped me to establish certain principles in place. And it helped me have a better dormitory as well because everybody knew what I expected. If you didn't know what I expected, let me tell you, everybody who's in that dorm, they'll tell you, it'll work out. You don't like it right now, but it'll work out. So I hope that I wasn't rambling too much. I hope that you guys did take something out of this. If you didn't or if you did, drop it in the comment section. Hit the thumbs up. Give me some likes. Hit the subscribe button. Share it. And if you have any questions, drop them down there as well. And we're going to keep this thing going. Until the next time, peace.